Hey everyone, welcome to the Daily Fantasy Sports Roundtable brought to you by FantasyLabs. I'm Matthew Freedman, the editor-in-chief, and in this episode, we're going to talk about short slate strategy. And by we, I mean not me, but these guys. I'm joined by three very special guests. One of them is Chris Raybon, at Chris Raybon on Twitter. He's the senior DFS editor at 4for4 and the host of the DFS MVP podcast. Chris, I believe that you were the first roundtable guest that we ever had, and I think we did a show transitioning from NFL to NBA, so it's great to have you back on. How's it going?
It's going good, man. Thanks for having me back on. I'm excited to talk some DFS with you guys, man. I'm kind of chilling out after football season, but I'm doing some NBA research right now. Excited to get playing after this All-Star break ends.
Yeah, it's good to have you on the show, and someone's got to class it up a little bit, so I think you're the man to do that there. And also joining us and making his roundtable debut is Mike Petta at Hoop2410. He's a full-time DFS player, a contributor to Roto Grinders, and a co-host of Grinders Live. Hoop, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Kind of good timing, break up this All-Star break a little bit. I have two young kids, so I spent a lot of time at Chuck E. Cheese, Legoland, and things like that. So ready to get back to the grind.
Yeah, also just living the dream, though. I think, if I could spend an entire day at Chuck E. Cheese, that would be pretty ideal.
It's fun. It's fun stuff, I'll tell you that much. I definitely get into the mix and get competitive with the youngsters, no doubt about that.
Yeah, what's the go-to game for you, Hoop? That's
that football toss game. Have you seen it?
Oh yeah, Tony's got that down too.
Yeah, me and him are going back. Of course, Tony, Big T, is the best at everything. So as soon as I mentioned to him, I can nail the all-star level every single time. He not only gets to the all-star level, like he breaks the scoreboard to over 1,000. You know how he is.
Yeah, no, that's classic. I once lost quite a bit of jelly beans on a football game throwing prop. So yeah, I'm not like you or Big T, unfortunately.
Well, it's like you can't throw it like a football, you just have to put it in essentially.
Yeah.
And of course, that is Peter Jennings already talking about degeneracy. Pete, you've been on the show, I think, almost as much as I have. Everyone can follow him on Twitter at CSURAM88. He's a co-founder of FantasyLabs, a DraftKings analyst, and a two-time DFS world champ. Pete, rumor has it that you're good at shooting high school three-pointers. How's it going?
Well, I'm working on that. Hoop and I have some action on that too. So I got to keep training for that. But just got back from Florida. Had a lot of skill game props out there and itching for some NBA. And we certainly have a lot of interesting stuff going on with the league right now. So it should be fun and excited to talk some short slate stuff too as well.
Yeah, let's go ahead and get into it. And I think the first question is that, and maybe I have a skewed sense of this because of the DFS players I know, they're just total degenerates like Pete. But how necessary is it to grind out the short slates if you are or if you want to be a full-time DFS player? Do you need the extra volume that short slates provide? And Chris, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, well, I'm probably not as much of a full-time player as these other two guys. I'm still full-time at 4for4 until they fire me. But what I will say is that, I think if you're a full-time DFS player, you're obviously going to be wanting to play a decent amount of cash games, if not a majority of cash games, just because you're probably looking for some more consistent income. And I think as the slate shrinks, your cash game edge does kind of shrink a little bit. So if you're just playing DFS full-time, I would probably say, one of the most worthwhile things you can do for times like this is, not necessarily be in a position where you only know one sport. You have to kind of force yourself. Like maybe if there's an NBA short slate, you can play some hockey or some golf or something like that. But what I will say is that from my experience, anyhow, I think there is still a lot more. There's a lot of dead money in some of the maybe lower stakes but high prize pool tournaments on short slates, and those are usually what I like to dive into the most on short slates. I usually scale back my cash game allocations as far as bankroll, and I will kind of look to play some pretty low stakes but tournaments that I think some casual players will enter in, because that's where I kind of have found an edge. And a lot of people don't talk about them, but I tend to do pretty well in those.
Hoop, any thoughts on that?
To answer your question, how necessary are they? Not necessary at all. I mean, it like you said in the opening, it's a true degenerate slate, degenerate grind. You know, I interpret this in two different ways. You know, short slates can be like the main slate if there's only like 3 or 4 games, like a NBA slate. You know, sometimes on a Thursday we only get 3 or 4 games. That's a short slate. Or these secondary slates, like the roll off from the main slate where you get all the games starting at 9 p.m. Eastern or later. Sometimes there's 4 or 5 of those games. So it's not necessary to grind those at all. You know, yeah, just, you know, to add on to what Raybon said there, it's, you know, I'd say maybe like 2 or 3 years ago, there's probably a pretty big edge in these, but there's a lot of smart people now playing these slates. And there's some really smart people that are only playing these slates that pass on like the main slates. They focus on these 2-3 game slates, and they've nailed it down to a science. So the edge is pretty small. You're talking 2v2, 3v2 situation or 3v3 situations for the most part. So they're not necessary. And, you know, I think the edge is shrinking quite a bit.
That's interesting. Yeah. And Pete, just kind of a follow-up on this. So Hoop was talking about some people who are maybe sort of short slate specialist. Any thoughts on that? Like, why would someone focus on short slates instead of main slates?
Well, there's a couple guys I know that do that definitely have a lot of success, and really it's just about finding better action, better games with better opponents. And I think that's where the edge would come in, is if you can find better opponents in these short slates. But yeah, in general, they're getting more efficient all the time. A decent amount of the pros are playing them now. So whereas in the past they were pretty there wasn't as much volume, but there weren't as many sharp players playing them. So a lot of times the slates, you can't even spend all the money, which, you know, basically eliminates all the edge unless there's someone significantly cheaper than a player that most people are going to play because they can't spend all the money. So it's pretty dynamic in which slates are good to play in terms of profitability, but they're absolutely not necessary to play for like the daily sports like NBA, MLB, NHL. If you want to make a living playing DFS, there's a ton of really successful guys that haven't played them. So yeah, I think that's pretty much my thoughts. I do think Chris made a really good point, and shout out to Chris too, who listened to his pod every week this year and thought it was awesome. So Chris, killer job on that. And yeah, I think that's probably where there's more value now, is figuring out a way to be contrarian in these tournaments, because it's pretty easy to tell who's going to be chalky. And, you know, a lot of these guys are really heavily owned because there's so few games. So, and especially a smaller, you know, a sport with more short-term variance, there might be a bigger edge like baseball or hockey.
Yeah, so, just to add on to that a little bit too, it's not that hard to be contrarian, because you're talking a much smaller player pool. So to me, I think the easiest thing to do to be contrarian, which a lot of people feel uncomfortable doing, is just simply leaving money on the table. Like, leave $500 or $600. Don't necessarily go out there and try to dodge all the chalk and avoid the chalk. Play the chalk, but pick a couple spots and just leave that money on the table and feel okay with it.
I think it was in the NFL, actually. I liked short slates a lot more, because I think in the NFL, studs are a lot less reliable. And just by fading a stud, it would almost force you to leave money on the table. And if you're fading, say, Dez Bryant, you're not really losing that much expected value, because wide receivers or whoever are so volatile. In the NBA, it's a little you have to be a little more creative sometimes when you're doing it, because the studs generally do perform up to what they're expected to a little more often. But I do agree that that's a great point. Just leave some money on the table. Just do things that you wouldn't normally do as much of in a main slate.
So, yeah, good thoughts there. And I think, I mean, here's a follow-up question on contrarianism, and Hoop, you might have some thoughts on this. So you talked about leaving money on the table and the idea that it might be easier in a shorter slate to be contrarian. I could see how some people might see that there are fewer players, and in some ways maybe because of that, fewer ways or fewer options to be contrarian. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's kind of what I said. I mean, there's just not as many options, so the chalk is going to be super chalky. You know, if there's a popular player, you're talking, even in these tournaments, you're talking, you know, up to 60, 70%. So, I mean, if there's a guy $600 or $700 cheaper, maybe roll out that same lineup you're looking at and just play the cheaper guy, and don't worry about that $600-700 or whatever it may be.
Yeah. Now, do you take short slate action into account when you are making allocations in your portfolio? So, like, do you actually distinguish between main and short slates in how much action you play, and in the ratio of cash games versus GPPs that you play?
It doesn't change that much for me, because, I mean, I'm never going to get up to an uncomfortable amount of action on a short slate. Like for me, for a new player, it's probably more important. But for a player, like me that plays for as much as I do on a nightly basis, I'm never going to get up to an uncomfortable point or a point where I shouldn't be playing on a small slate because the action is just simply not available. But for newer players or someone with a smaller bankroll, absolutely. I mean, you're talking these situations where, I mean, it's most likely coming down to a 2v2 or a 3v3 situation. And for the most part, those aren't good situations to overexpose your bankroll to. So definitely newer players, smaller bankroll players, limit yourself here. There's just no reason to push it.
All right. Well, Pete, I know you play almost every slate, whether you want to or not. It's almost like a point of pride at this point. How do you allocate?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just trying to get as much action as I can in these smaller slates, especially depending on the sport. But yeah, I mean, there's really not, enough volume to go around to make it so it really impacts the bottom line in a huge way. But it's just about getting more volume, I think. So sometimes there's a hedge, maybe in football, where you can get a nice hedge in, or you can make a contrarian play that can balance out your portfolio a little bit better. But yeah, there's just not as much volume here, so it's a little bit more challenging. The one thing I will say, with some of like these NBA slates that come in during the playoffs, there's interesting dynamics there when the pricings change. But yeah, it's one of those things where you're just trying to get as much volume as you can. And outside of getting like a really high stakes head-to-head, there really just isn't that much volume.
Mm-hmm. Chris, any thoughts on allocation when it comes to short slates?
Yeah, well, for NBA, as somebody who's not playing as much action as these guys, and for maybe the more casual listeners out there, I would say that just kind of, if you want a concrete way to do it, maybe take the amount of bankroll that you would feel comfortable allocating on whatever number of games you would feel comfortable allocating a full amount for that day, like maybe an 8-game slate, you would feel comfortable allocating whatever percentage of bankroll you normally do, and then divide it by the number of games. So if there's only a 4-game slate, you only play half as much, or if there's a 2-game slate, you play 25% as much. Me personally, I tend to I usually don't play cash games on short slates. I'll usually have either 100% in tournaments or something really close to that. So that's what I do.
Mm-hmm. Now, Pete, I think you play almost every DFS sport, if not all of them. In your experience, have you found that there are particular sports that lend themselves to short slates better than others?
Yeah, I mean, I think football is the clear number one, just because obviously there's only 17 regular season weeks and 3 playoff weeks. So anytime you can get more volume in football, it's normally a good thing. So I think that's by far the best short slate sport. But outside of that, I really like the higher variance, or at least short-term higher variance sports. I think baseball is a fun one to play, especially for tournaments. NHL I've messed around a little bit with. I think there's some value in tournaments there. But the toughest one, which I end up playing a lot, is basketball. It's just very hard to figure out how to gain an edge, even though it's getting more popular. So I would say the short-term variance sports are better for the daily ones, but NFL is far and away the best one.
Raybon, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I 100% agree with Pete about NFL being the best one, just because the nature of the scoring, where a touchdown can swing the slate so much. You could even maybe get an edge there, number one, by just what I said before, fading a stud who will probably be highly owned, and just knowing something like red zone targets. For example, most players only get 1 to 2 red zone targets, or targets inside the 5 or the 10 per game. So if you can kind of find an obscure player that maybe has a shot at getting a target or a carry inside the 5 or inside the 10, and he also provides leverage on a highly owned player or a stud or something like that, you can still maybe find an edge in a tournament that way in NFL. Whereas I said in NBA, it's so consistent that it's a lot harder. You're going to end up, as Hoop said, with a lot of just 1v1, 2v2, 3v3 situations, a lot less of an edge. So I would say definitely NFL and the higher variance sports lend themselves a lot better.
Hoop, do you agree? Is it NFL for you?
Yeah, I mean it's NFL one for sure. I mean just based on a volume standpoint, the amount of action you can get, the not necessarily even the amount of action, the amount of diversified action. You know, all your action's not going to be against the same DFS players. And then number two for me is baseball. I think baseball is actually a pretty good sport to play the late slates because they are. Pretty popular I think mostly to the pitching because a lot of times you're getting those West Coast pitchers that are going late. So you have like a Clayton Kershaw going or a Bumgarner. And a lot of people, like playing those slates because they like, rostering those guys. So I think those slates are more popular than the basketball ones for that reason. So it's definitely football and by a long shot though.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that. Now, Raybon, back to you. So the perception is that short slates are tougher and that the competition is harder. So as we've mentioned, like the waters tend to be, I guess, more infested with sharks for some of these slates. One, does that in your experience, does that seem to be the case? But then how do you think that it's possible for inexperienced players to get experience without totally losing their bankroll while playing these short slates?
I think it is true. I think short slates are tougher, especially as you go up in stakes at this point, as both of the guys mentioned earlier. When I think short slates first started out, there were a lot less of sharper players and sharks playing these slates, but now there's just a lot of people on there looking for action. And, you're going to run into a Pete or a Hoop or somebody like that if you're playing really high stakes. So I would say if you're an inexperienced player, I would say the best way to go is just, again, try to find some of those low stakes tournaments with those attractive first, second place prizes, probably a large prize pool. There's usually a lot of novice players or people who are just not even really playing to be super competitive, but just playing so that they can maybe see some of their players playing on a national TV game, like a TNT game on the Thursday night or something like that. You'll find a lot more of those players in the lower stakes games. And I think that's probably the best way. Obviously, any lower stake you're not going to be taking too much risk. So I would just say, in my experience, I would probably stick to the low stakes if I was an inexperienced player, and I would play a lot more tournaments than cash games.
Hoop, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, he nailed it right there. That's basically what I was going to say. Probably like 2 years ago, and I know Pete can definitely attest to this because he was one of the first guys that was out there playing every single degenerate slate. But 2 years ago, there's a massive edge in these games because there wasn't many pros playing the games. Now it's flooded with guys looking for extra action. The top guys in the industry are basically playing every single slate, so it becomes pretty difficult at the top level. So if you're a new player, lower bankroll player, yeah, definitely focus on those large field tournaments with the big prize pools, the big payouts, and just differentiate yourself. And kind of what I alluded to earlier, it's not that hard to differentiate yourself in these things. You know where the chalk's gonna lie, and go ahead, not necessarily dodge the chalk, but find some logical pivots and leave some money on the table. It's kind of the best way to do it, in my opinion.
Now, yeah. Pete, I'm going to have a follow-up question on this for you. So at FantasyLabs, we have the multi-lineup tool, and it seems like that there would maybe be potentially more of an edge in mass entering some GPPs for these shorter slates. I think it may be in comparison to the larger slates. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that or if you think that's true.
I definitely think there can be, depending on the slate. And the one really interesting thing is one challenge I found, because I did want to do that this year, and I did it a couple times, but not nearly as much as I wanted. And I think the challenge was, oftentimes you're editing a lot of different teams, especially on DraftKings, before these slates start up. So you can lock in your cash game teams, which I did get in every time this year, but making a ton of teams was a challenge, especially if you already had a lot of lineups on DraftKings and you wanted to make sure you edited them and swapped in the right spot. So I think that's the case for a lot of these guys, and I do think that creates a bigger edge. And there's definitely a lot of value in just finding a strong pivot and going with it. So, yeah, I think the key in these short slates is just avoiding guys like Hoop. You can take on clowns like me. If you want to tilt off and play a high stakes game, I'm right there. And yeah.
Always angle shooting for more action. What do you know?
There's definitely the one edge I would say is if you do want to post head to heads, people in general, the slates can be really dead, but sometimes you'll get, total randoms tilting off. So I think that's kind of the value in it, is finding some high stakes games. And yeah, if you can just be smart and avoid the goats like Hoop, you're in good shape.
Well, Hoop, have you found that particular short slate edges when it comes to like different sites? So do you think there's any advantage to playing short slates on FanDuel versus DraftKings or versus any of the other sites that are out there?
I haven't seen much of a difference. I mean, for the most part, you're going against the same guys. I mean, at the high stakes level, it's the same guys that are typically playing the smaller slates on DraftKings and FanDuel. But I think more so just sport to sport. I mean, if you really want to get into these short slates, it's definitely football. That's the sport you're going to want to focus on. But, I really haven't found much of a difference. I mean, I tend to play more of the short slates on FanDuel opposed to DraftKings. I have played DraftKings short slates, but for me, most of my action is on FanDuel. I know Pete hits both a lot harder, so he might have a better answer than I do for that one.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in the past, historically, FanDuel's done better, but DraftKings has definitely made a big surge in this regard. It's really spread out. For me, it's just about getting the head-to-head action. So kind of hit or miss each night, depending on how things go. I have noticed that both sites have gotten more saturated with a lot of the top guys looking for more action. So I think the edge is definitely in the tournaments, and that'll be fun to see how progresses and grows, because that's one nice thing, especially like for football. One slate that is just degenerate central and you get so much action is the primetime slate. It is fantastic. Sometimes it's terrible because the games are bad and you can't spend all the salary, but if you ever have a nice couple offensive games, it can be really, really nice. And one other thing I will say with these slates, especially on like the primetime or a 2-day short slate, people almost always will have their lineup shifted with more guys that night. They want the instant gratification of playing guys that night versus the second game. So my ideal short slate would be a 2-game slate where the Sunday night game is not expected to be that high scoring, and then you have the shootout with all the studs on Monday night. That's normally my favorite type of slate.
Chris, any thoughts there on kind of site-to-site differences?
I think on DraftKings, because I'm looking at it more from a tournament perspective, I think I do like them on DraftKings a little bit more, because even though you have a limited player pool on these short slates, you have some of those slots on DraftKings where you can kind of fit multiple positions into one slot. So you can, in NFL, you have like a flex position, or in NBA, you have that util or something like that. So that allows you to be a little more creative and maybe differentiate yourself a little more than on FanDuel, where you're kind of locked into the roster spots.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I hear that. Now, Pete, you had mentioned that a main priority is just finding those head-to-heads. Given the dynamic of short slates and the limited options, what is your approach to cash games?
My approach is post the head-to-heads and make the optimal lineup and hope that someone's as degenerate enough as me and wants the action. That's basically the approach. I in football, sometimes I'll make if I think something's really close, I'm definitely more of a team hedge life than other guys. But I mean, I'm just really trying to make the optimal lineup. I definitely don't play as many tournaments. I focused on cash over the last couple of years, but I do think that's one adjustment I'm going to have to make in 2017 is shifting some of that action towards tournaments, because I do think there's a little bit more value there and just got a lot more saturated in the cash game. So in the past, it's just been making the optimal lineups, post to head-to-heads, and hope someone scoops them up. But definitely going to change my approach a little bit this year to more tournaments.
But Pete, so your cash game approach in short slates is exactly the same as it is in big slates?
Pretty much. I mean, you're just trying to make the best team. One thing I would say is almost always you want to play the studs, because the lower tier values aren't going to be as good. This is in cash games. I think there's a ton of merit to fading in tournaments, but in cash games, oftentimes on a night there's the stars and scrubs, and then there's a balance approach, and they can kind of come really close together in terms of what the expectation is. But in these shorter slates, it's harder for a more balanced lineup to work out oftentimes, just because there's not as many good values. So I do think that the stars and scrubs approach normally works better, just because you want to lock in the equity of those really top studs, especially when there's just not as many choices. But again, every slate's dynamic, and you have to adjust. But pretty much the same approach, is trying to make the highest expectation team.
Mm-hmm. Hoop, what is your approach to cash games? I mean, is it similar to Peter's there? I mean, do you go more of a stars and scrubs approach?
Yeah, no, I fully agree with what Pete said. I mean, you're just going to want to try to make the best team. And for me, like my favorite times to play the late slates is if I know that a guy is a big fade for me. If I have a decision, like do I want Bledsoe or do I want like Kyrie Irving? And I end up going with Kyrie Irving, and I know Bledsoe is going to be a big fade, and Bledsoe is playing in the later games. I like playing those later slates just to kind of hedge a little bit against my decision that I made earlier. So I can roster Bledsoe on the late slate. It'll probably be popular. That's fine. But it gives me an opportunity to have some ownership on a guy that I know is going to be like a big, massive fade for me on like the main slate. So it's the same mindset when you're building the teams, but those are situations that I like to expose myself to on these later slates.
I like that. The idea of using the later slate as something of an insurance policy. I think that's a really interesting idea.
The best thing about the late slates in the past that no longer exists, but it used to be just the print factory was you could look at everyone's team obviously on FanDuel when it locks. So, baseball, I used to look at Love's Base's team, and there'd be some guys that I didn't have exposure to that he would have, and I would fire up the late slates wherever he was and would just fire at his guys. But unfortunately, you can't do that anymore. So I guess that's a worthless piece of info. But that was the golden days of the late slates in DFS.
Now, Raybon, I know you said that you focus more on GPPs for the shorter slates as opposed to cash games, but the few times you do play cash games, what is your approach?
Well, I think it's similar to what these guys said. I'm definitely trying to make the optimal lineup, the best team. But what I will say is I do look at projections a little more closely, which might sound weird because it's a shorter slate. But if an optimal lineup is optimal by only like a couple of tenths of a point, then I'm maybe saying, okay, maybe I will try to go away from it a little more, especially if I'm playing head to head to try to get some leverage, some differentiation. And another thing I'll say is, and it goes back to Peter's point about you really do want to get those studs in there. So sometimes I think maybe people in cash, they'll be afraid to play maybe a Westbrook because maybe then they'll have to balance that out by playing, say, a bench player or something like that, or they might not be able to fit the highest stud that they can, but I think you have to kind of really look at projections and say, sometimes a bench guy compared with a stud will actually be kind of your best way to go. And a lot of people might say, hey, well, I can't play this guy because he's coming off the bench. But, if that's going to be the best lineup, then I'd say, go ahead and do it. So I think in cash, I get a little more unorthodox than I normally would. Whereas I'm a lot more willing to play a guy that maybe only projected for 24 minutes if I think he's going to be a good dollar per point value or something like that.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, let's talk some about GPPs and Chris, let's stay with you. So short slates, it seems like they would lend themselves more to chaos. If something unexpected happens in one game, then a relatively high percentage of the players in the slate are impacted by that randomness. So, and you've talked a little bit about your approach to the shorter slates and GPPs, but I'm wondering if you can build on it a little bit.
Sure. So what I really like to do, and this is for GPPs in general, but especially in short slates, is I like to find one player that I know is going to be popular that I have a contrarian view on, that I want to be underweight on. And, I want to find by the same token, I want to find one guy that maybe won't be that popular that I feel better about. And I really try to identify those two things and then build my whole portfolio based on that. And this is a situation where on a short slate, I think personally, I'm not sure if the guys agree or not, but I'm a lot more likely, and I even try to get 100% exposure to certain players and 0% exposure to certain players because there's a lot less players in the pool overall. So I really want to have that advantage. Like if a stud is owned 75% and I like that stud, I want 100% of them. If there's a guy that I think is going to be owned, only 50% or 25%, but I don't like them, then I want a full fade. So I kind of try to maximize the extremes and just I'll take the L if I have to, but I want to kind of maximize my upside by kind of going extreme with some of my player exposures.
Mm-hmm. Hoop, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to agree with what Chris said there. Yeah, and it kind of varies sport to sport. In a sport like baseball, where the variance is super high, if you're playing on, a 3-game late slate and, Mike Trout's involved, and it's pretty obvious that, for the most part, regardless of his matchup, he's going to be massively owned. So in a sport like baseball, there's just really no point to play him at all. Go ahead and look for a logical pivot, get off him and play a guy like Nelson Cruz, who's, typically involved in the late slates, won't be as highly owned, has multiple home run upside. So in a sport like baseball, it's pretty simple. I mean, you definitely want to avoid the chalk in that situation. Different sports, the logic would vary a little bit, but baseball, I think, is super simple. And if you can peg a guy to be highly owned, I mean, you just, like Chris said, just take him off your list, 0% exposure.
Yeah, so it's more of an ownership play as opposed to what you are thinking in terms of projections or things like that.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. Well, that's really good thoughts by both of you guys. And I definitely like to do that. I think there's more extremes. I mean, I have a ton of respect for Hoop and how he plays, just balls of steel, rolling out one lineup with all the action in all these different spots. So he does hedge it a little bit with these slates, which I think makes a ton of sense. But yeah, I think that you definitely want to take a huge stand in these spots, especially in tournaments. I mean, I think you have to. I mean, there's no point in covering a lot of the bases because then you're just going to be losing to the fees. So I think that makes sense, and certainly something I want to do. I do think that baseball is probably the best sport for that of the daily ones, and I'm really excited to dabble in that more this year because I do think there'll be some nice edges, especially in the beginning of the season. When we don't know that much about these teams too. There'll be certain assumptions about teams and players, and a lot of that might not come to the fruition in the beginning of the year, especially with all the short-term variants. So I think it makes a ton of sense there, and the only applicable spot in NBA is if like a big injury breaks with like a little bit of time left, there might be a bigger edge just because some people set their teams in advance and don't come back. And also, if you can find a guy who is coming off the bench or not named a starter that you think is going to get a lot of run, oftentimes that can be a really good play, obviously, in any circumstance, but you can take them in the shorter slates if their expectations really similar to the starter and have a pretty nice leg up.
All right. Well, Hoop, you mentioned earlier ownership and how it tends to be inflated in the short slates. And so obviously that can play into your construction for lineups, but I think it also could impact stacking. And stacking is its own thing, kind of very sport to sport with how it functions. But what are your thoughts on stacking with GPPs in these shorter slates?
Yeah, I mean, obviously in a sport like baseball, and it's no secret now that stacking is definitely the way to go. I mean, you want as many guys from a team as possible, and that varies site to site, with the max number of players from a team varying on FanDuel and DraftKings, and what's 4 versus 5, or can you do 6 on DraftKings? I'm not sure. But yeah, stacking is definitely in baseball is the way to go. When you talk about some of the other sports like basketball, if you're playing one of these smaller slates, maybe stacking up a game. If you think one game is going to be very popular and this game over here is not going to be very popular, stack it up. Maybe this one turns into a blowout, the one you stacked up stays competitive, or even potentially goes into overtime so you can get that big boost. So stacking is always a viable route in basically any sport. On the smaller slates, you're not going to be as sneaky because the options just aren't as prevalent. You're talking a much smaller player pool to start with, but stacking is always a viable approach. And there's different ways you can do it, sport to sport.
Mm-hmm. Pete, how do you approach stacking in short slate GPPs?
I mean, I think you have to do it, and I think it's just all about finding contrarian stacks. I think Hoop made a really nice point for basketball, finding a contrarian game, because a lot of times people say, oh, I'm stacking a game on a full slate with the expectation of overtime. And normally that's pretty bad just because overtime doesn't happen enough and the equity is just not there, where it's normally not a good decision unless it's like a perfect game where both teams are thin and it's really fast paced. But in these shorter slates, especially for GPPs, I think it makes a ton of sense because what you really need to have happen is one game not to be competitive, a big blowout, and the other one to stay competitive, and you can have a huge edge. So I think that makes a ton of sense. And then in baseball, obviously, stacking is huge in tournaments, and you can definitely find much more contrarian stacks in those tournaments. I mean, people really load up on the chalk. They play their cash game teams in tournaments even more so than they do on the main slate. So I think there's a ton of value there, and I think that that's something all of us are excited for coming up here.
Chris, what's your approach to stacking in GPPs?
Yeah, in baseball, I think, as these guys said, you have to do it, and it's just a matter of kind of finding something contrarian, maybe going with a little different part of the batting order than most people are. I like to do that in Coors Field a lot of the time. And then in NBA, I think, right now I'm actually doing some research on stacking, kind of finding out that if you're gonna stack 2 players on a team is probably the sweet spot for NBA. As Pete kind of said, you really can't count on overtime on a large slate, and you don't want to just stack up, 3-4 players in the same game. It's probably not going to work out. But on these short slates, I think you have to be willing to create these larger NBA stacks, stacking, as Hoop said, a whole game, and preferably a contrarian game where maybe the field might think it's a blowout, so you stack it anyway. And you could also find some contrarian stacks in NBA by, if you think there's going to blow out, maybe you stack a couple of guys that are going to get some minutes off the bench. Maybe 2 guys off the bench, maybe a point guard and somebody else that you think can get more minutes than usual because it will be a blowout or something like that. So I think you really have to be willing in the NBA to just create larger stacks, more bold stacks. And, in the NFL, even though the season's over, I think you just have to be more willing to kind of use stacks that you wouldn't normally, like maybe use correlations that you wouldn't normally, have a defense and then opposing offensive players and running backs on opposite teams in the same game and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Now, some of you guys have talked about the ways in which you like to be contrarian in the short slate GPP stacks, but Pete, since you are Mr. Contrarian, except you're not, let's get your opinion on this. What is the main way in which you try to be contrarian in GPP short slates?
Well, I think you can go against team totals a little bit more than you would on a main slate if you're really trying to go against it. Oftentimes, with a full slate of games, you can find maybe not the highest total. Let's say we're talking about football, but you can still stack up, a relatively high total. I think you have to take a little more risk in these short slates to be contrarian. And then in addition to that, I think always the best way to go contrarian, and if it's applicable in a short slate, it's fantastic, is to find a different roster construction. So if everyone's, let's say the Steelers are on a slate, and there's 3 good games, everyone's going to play Big Ben, Antonio Brown, and Le'Veon Bell. Well, that has the highest expectations in what I do in cash. If you can find a reason or a merit to play a more balanced team, versus the stars and scrubs, which I do think is in general is best for cash, then you have a much more contrarian team. So I think if you can go with a roster construction, is going to be different than others just based on the slate dynamics. That's almost always the best way to be contrarian.
Mm-hmm. Chris, any thoughts on how you like to be contrarian in GPPs?
Yeah, well, I'll start with NBA since we're in the middle of the NBA season right now. I really like the idea of kind of finding somebody off the bench or because I think in these short slates, I think everyone's kind of focused in on the starting 5 for the teams, even if there's only 2 games. And people are and that kind of goes into what Peter said about just lineup construction, because people are kind of constructing their lineups based on these starting 5s. And I think if you can find a guy that's going to come off the bench, and I'm not talking about, Jamal Crawford, who, might come off the bench, but still gets a lot of, still puts up decent fantasy production. I'm talking about a guy that, probably has like a good game every 6, 7, 8 games. But if you can kind of find that guy, especially if he's super cheap, maybe a backup big man comes in, gets like 10 rebounds and also gets 10, 12 points because he gets some offensive rebound putbacks or a couple blocks, or you found a guy that comes off the bench, shooting guard, and he gets hot from 3-point range or something, gets a couple of lucky steals. You can be in business, and you're going to have a guy that just a lot of people didn't have the balls to play or didn't think they needed to play because there were still starters that they could kind of construct their lineup around. And I think a lot of people on short slates in NBA are kind of busy just trying to cover their bases with the different starters rather than trying to invest too much in these bench guys. So that's kind of my favorite way in NBA. In NFL, I mentioned it already. It's usually just fading a stud and finding some obscure guy that has a chance at either a red zone touchdown or in certain cases maybe a guy that if there's ever a time I'm going to play like a guy that I think is just can have one big play and that's it, it'll be in a short slate in NFL. I don't usually like playing those guys in big slates because I think even if a guy gets like a 70-yard touchdown and that's his one catch, he's still only getting like 13 points, whereas I want that 30-point upside. But in a short slate, if a guy gets a 70-yard touchdown like Philly Brown or somebody like that, that could swing the whole slate. And then just weird things like on DraftKings, you know, I'll play like a tight end in the flex and, you know, things like that.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. One thing I will say too, I've seen some interesting strategies on the Twitter machine about playing backup quarterbacks. I'm off that. Coop, what are your thoughts?
You had to serve that one up, huh? Yeah, definitely don't play backup quarterbacks on short slates to hedge your main slate lineups. That is not the optimal route to go. I can promise you that. But yeah, I mean, these guys, they nailed it. And I think the one point that Chris brought up earlier is you're gonna want to do things that you typically don't do on the main slate. You're gonna want to leave money on the table. You're gonna target nasty games, nasty total games. I think Pete brought up, like, in a very sport to sport. So like in basketball, you might target guys. Overexpose yourself to like a Utah Jazz game or a Memphis Grizzly game, where if you're playing the main slate, you're going to totally cross those guys off the list, even if you're trying to be contrarian for the most part. In baseball, I think it's pretty darn easy. You just avoid the super popular guys, and it's easy to kind of pinpoint who the popular guys are going to be. You know, Mike Trout in Los Angeles plays a lot of those late games, so if you're playing one of the late slates, he's going to be on the slate and he'll be popular. You just don't play him. I mean, you find a pivot. And then the same thing I brought up a few times on here, just leaving money on the table. And you can do that in basically any of the sports that you're playing, these smaller slates.
All right, good stuff there. Let's go around at the table one more time for some closing thoughts and words of wisdom. And Chris, let's start with you.
Yeah, I'd say, you know, if you're playing short slates, you know, the object is still to have a higher scoring lineup than the opponent, and it has to be different somewhere. So I'd say, you know, just don't lock yourself into just playing chalk or thinking you have to play anybody. You know, still try to be contrarian. And if you're an inexperienced player, I'd say you can kind of use short slates to get you comfortable with being contrarian on a larger slate, because by nature of playing a short slate, you're going to end up playing guys that you would have probably never thought to play on a large slate. And that might in turn just psychologically help you be a little more comfortable than playing contrarian in a large slate.
Yeah, I like that idea, sort of training for the main slate.
Yeah, it's the short slates are team degen slates, which obviously I'm a huge fan of, but you got to get in there. I think the best thing you can do is put yourself in the mindset of someone who might be having a bad NFL Sunday or something like that. And, you know, they're going to be chasing and trying to figure out the way someone like that might be thinking, and then leverage that to make better teams. So curious to hear Hoop's final thoughts. And then also one question for Hoop, special question. How do you do it, man, with balancing a family and the full-time DFS grind? Because Hoop's got the all-American family, beautiful kids, beautiful wife, somehow keeps it going and crushes the DFS game.
All right, I'll answer that one second. I'm going to answer Matt's question first. Just go back. I'm going to go back to your first question. You know, how necessary is it to play these slates? And I just don't think they're that necessary. I mean, if you're a new player just getting into this, don't feel like you have to play these small slates. They're super competitive. There's a lot of really sharp players that play all of them, like Pete. You know, he's not going to pass up on a slate. So definitely don't want to be overexposing yourself to CSU contests. So just overall, don't feel like you have to play them. If you are going to play them, just be smart with your bankroll, and, you know, definitely don't get a large portion of your bankroll or a bigger portion than you play on the main slate. So, yeah, that would be my, I guess, main point here. In terms of DFS with the full family and kids and stuff, it definitely could be challenging. There's no doubt about that. It became a lot easier for me recently because I just moved into a new home where I actually have an office. Previous to that, I didn't have an office, and I was kind of in the middle of chaos with a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old running around while I'm trying to build lineups. Some sports easier than others, like basketball lineup lock with a 4-year-old and 2-year-old running around the house, screaming, yelling. Not very optimal. Probably cost me a ton of money along the way, but you know, wouldn't trade it for the world. All
right, guys, good stuff. Thank you for being on the show. We've been speaking with Chris Raybon, Mike Petta, and Peter Jennings. You can follow them on Twitter at Chris Raybon, Hoop2410, and CSURAM88. And you can follow me on Twitter at MattFTheOracle. I'm Matthew Freedman, and this has been the Daily Fantasy Sports Roundtable brought to you by FantasyLabs. Thanks for tuning in.